fairly small group, so I think we can make this pretty much as an interactive session as we go along. So if you have any questions while we start talking about the topic, please feel free to ask. All right, so for what we're talking about as you move into the cloud and SaaS type of world, and again, part of my experience and what brought me to IBM is I was working for a FTSE 100 company in Europe. I have 4.5 years of experience where I brought that company into the public cloud, worked with the European regulators to be able to successfully do it. And prior to my departure, I actually sold the board of directors on the strategy of by 2017, we were going to be fully out of our wholly owned data centers and purely a cloud and SaaS-based operation model. So I work a lot with the European regulators on compliance. So it is possible to do it. So what we're going to talk about today, and again, feel free to ask any questions as we go along, is look at what's the current threat landscape look like? How do you evaluate the risk of cloud services? I'll give you a basic framework that I used in my organization to bring back of how do I map out the basic risk to make some decisions on what can go to the cloud right away, what may need to be reworked, and what should probably stay in-house. Some of the things that we'll take a look at are what are the best practices that are going on right now, what's being done from a service delivery point of view, and since a cloud environment is a shared environment, what is the customer's responsibility versus what's the data processor's responsibility. All right, this is just the standard IBM disclaimer in case I make any forward-looking statements. It says essentially from the product point of view, it may or may not happen, things like that. So really, as you look at how the cyber incidents and attacks have gone up over the years, have gone up essentially almost exponentially. So 2015, it was essentially, not only did we see some of the biggest breaches in history yet, we've seen how some of the cyber attacks can actually be about more than just the PII, more than just the personal information, where for the first time probably in the history of the attacks, at least from a private corporation point of view, where we've seen private corporations attacked and shut down rather than just theft of records. We've seen exfiltration of company intellectual property. We've seen workers having to be sent home because the networks were taken over. So that kind of goes to show that how the attacks have escalated, where now it's more than just about, can I get your personal information? Can I get your credit card information? So it's no secret that as this goes on now, more and more information security is presenting to the boards, and there's an expectation that you have some kind of strategy around how are you going to deal with the new threat vectors. What's the company's approach to dealing with information security, especially if you're going to move into a cloud and SaaS type of environment. So take a brief look at what's changed. We kind of mentioned the aggressiveness of the attacks has changed over time. But prior, when you look at the way people fundamentally work now and for the past 5 years has really changed how IT is done in general. And a lot of times, some corporations are still catching up from that legacy point of view. Because if you look as little as about 4 years ago, essentially enterprises mostly were captive workforces. You were issued company equipment. The only way into the environment was really, you VPN'd in. It was a company-owned device. There wasn't any kind of BYOD. And the attackers were pretty much mostly rogue individuals. You didn't see a huge amount of theft of intellectual property or PCI or for financial gain at the time. And a lot of the attacks were pretty noisy. They did leave a good amount of tracks on the environment. And so you were able to see them. And while some of them could be damaging to your infrastructure, they were pretty easy to track down and trace. So when you look at from the past 4.5 years to present, now pretty much people want to work the way they want to work. So you're using, you want availability of your data wherever, whenever, regardless of whether you're on a work device or whether you're on your own personal device. It's not that you have bad intentions, it's just that's the way the world works right now. So now we have pretty much a highly mobile workforce. It's really become about ubiquitous access, being able to access your data no matter where it is, access to work applications no matter where, no matter what equipment you're using. Now the attackers have also gotten highly organized. There's much more structure. The criminal networks really involve in escrow transactions now, and you can they sub out some of their work. So when you look at what's going on, you no longer have to have a wide range of expertise if you're an attacker. You just need to know where to advertise, saying you want a certain amount of access to boxes at a certain Fortune 500 company, and sooner or later somebody will reply, and then you exchange credentials, and they'll give you a try before you buy, and you can actually escrow the currency from a Bitcoin point of view, and once I test the access and it meets my satisfaction of what I want to do, then we complete the transaction. So again, these attacks are a lot more organized, a lot more focused on the overall organizations, and really it's stealthy now. Because now when you look at moving into the cloud and SaaS world, it's become you have to protect the application, the data, no matter where it lives. So you have to assume that you have an adequate level of protection around your data, no matter where it is in the environment. Not just thinking about, well, if it's in my data center, it must be good. So when it comes to cloud services, how do you identify the risk of a cloud service or whether you're ready to move to it? So what I've done prior in my past is worked with the technology leadership team to come up with a risk and maturity model. Essentially, this is just a basic model where I took a data center tiering model. You have tier 1 through tier 5, where tier 1 is our highly regulated applications. That could be your SOX data, it could be your HIPAA data. Tier 5 could be your temporary or testing environments. And then what I did with the technology leadership team and our CIO is we picked 5 domains. That would be application security, network and systems, data security, secure ops, and strategy, and essentially apply a CMM-like model as far as the level of maturity. And as you'll see on the next slide is what we defined as a team within each of those levels of maturity, what's the minimal acceptable level of security controls. And what we did is by abstracting and talking about the characteristics, okay, you need to do something for identity, you need to do something for IPS or IDS, as you'll see on the next slide. By abstracting it, it helps give you a better view of, as I look in the cloud environment, can I still do that? Because odds are you probably can. It'll be through somewhat infrastructure as code, but this way it's no longer married to a certain set of appliances or a certain set of infrastructure. So essentially what we did as a team, then after that is under that application security domain, we defined 5 key areas, or actually 6 key areas around application security, and then we also defined what the expectation and the maturity level is. So for example, in this part when we're talking about secure code control, if something is a 4, we expect secure code control placed with automated scanning. So as soon as somebody deposits something in the Git, it should get scanned. And then if you go all the way out to level 5, not only is it automatically scanned, but you're expecting some degree of remediation and built into the SDLC. And what happens is by doing this and defining this model ahead of time and getting the agreement with the technology teams, and now what this becomes is if I can demonstrate that I'm a tier 1 application and I have to be a 4.4.5, 4.4 all the way across the board, now it becomes a business decision. Because if I can demonstrate that I can meet those characteristics in a hybrid cloud versus my own data center, now I'm agnostic as to whether I do it in my own data center or whether I move it to the cloud. And from an audit point of view, since we've already defined what the requirements are and can demonstrate it, as long as you can do that within that environment, you're fine. And what that did is it enabled the business to essentially make it a business decision as far as do you want to go to the cloud or do you want to stay within our own internal data centers. So the additional part of how do you do it is, in addition to coming up with that maturity framework and defining that criteria or the characteristics, is now we started focusing, okay, so taking those characteristics and moving it into the area of how do we really focus on the core cloud security capabilities. So the first part looks at how do you manage access? Is your identity management tool, is it extensible to your different environments? In my prior position, we were focused on 4 different cloud environments. So you need to make sure that your identity management system is capable of spanning across those environments, because the last thing you want to do is remove somebody's identity from your own system and forget maybe they still had access to Salesforce, maybe they had still access to Oracle or something like that, because then you'll have your next audit finding. So the other thing that we looked at is, going to the next section is how do you protect the data? How do you have, how are you doing IDS, IPS? Are you doing encryption from end to end? What things do you need to look at to protect the data, whether it's within your walls or external to your walls? And the last part was a big one also is how do you gain visibility? Because most of us got into the cloud before we actually knew we were in the cloud. A lot of times it was through your third-party vendors that were outsourcing things that didn't notify you at the time. And the other key thing too is, again, we kind of talked about the company employees want to get their work done. If there's something that's going to help them get their job done, a lot of times we saw people going You guys all familiar with stealth IT, or at least the notion of it? Where people go out, you take out your corporate Amex, you can spin up an instance, and all of a sudden you can be out working, whereas maybe the standard provisioning route might have been 3 to 6 months of going through the normal procurement route. So one of the key things that we've also built in is how do you do the discovery? As part of moving into that cloud environment, you want to make sure that not only is your whole environment that's out in the cloud, is it consistent from a regulatory point of view, and you have your policies laid down on it, you also want to be able to pick up if somebody starts spinning up a rogue instance, if somebody went using their corporate card and is now running an environment that's out of compliance. You want to make sure that your orchestration tools can actually spot those environments as well. So as you continue, you look at the different consumption models, and we spoke about this for most of the day today as well. When you're looking at you're doing the SaaS, whether you're leveraging the APIs or virtual appliances, again, that's going to determine how do you structure your overall cloud environment. You saw a lot of times now, even with regulated data, there's the opportunity to keep that data in-house if you want, and just move the front end into the cloud so you can leverage the advantage of that development environment as well. And this is just really, when you look at infrastructure as service, PaaS, and SaaS, how do you, it still goes back to how do you manage the access, how do you protect the data, and how are you gaining visibility? And again, some of the key things as you're having that conversation is if you're doing infrastructure as a service, do you understand if you're rolling your own environment, what do you need to do from your firewall configuration, what's your responsibilities to the customer, versus where if it's a SaaS product, your expectations are that the product is fully secure from end to end, or about any potential deficiencies that might be there. So the key thing is, as you're getting into that environment, is to understand from an architecture and capability point of view, what do you need to do as a customer, what are you expecting us to do as the provider as well to make sure that everything is covered. So some of the things for the additional resources, if you want to see how we go through the secure engineering and secure testing, it's a publicly facing website that's available. So I'm not going to read to you guys everything that's on there. But from reference material, we publish a lot of the reference material that will also help as you look at the risk framework and say, okay, is it adequate? Is it not adequate from a security point of view? So currently, right now, we have over 140 SaaS offerings. We're fully staffed from a security point of view, not only from a SaaS model also, but we know who has access to the data, and from a European point of view, that's usually super important, who has access, where the keys stored, where's the data stored. Other things to take a look at too is from a data transfer point of view. We can completely localize the data, but things to ask also from a question point of view, if it's within the EU construct and has to be localized to a certain country, for instance, maybe Germany. If you have remote access to that application or that product from outside of Germany, that still constitutes a data transfer. So you still need to make sure you're covering that from a data transfer agreement or a European model clause type of agreement. All right, so from a SaaS point of view and from a cloud type of point of view, some of the security testing that we do covers pen testing, covers separation of duties, and even from the separation of duty point of view, if you're a DevOps model, it's still doable within the cloud. We were DevOps before. Some of the things that we're looking for is, do you have the one-touch deployment, or as you're going from your test environment into your prod environment, is the dev team checking out maybe a password from there? So there's still ways to do SOD even in a DevOps environment. You have to be aware of, we test for malware. You have the ability to configure IPSs and IDSs. And one of the things that we'll talk about later is running an infrastructure security team and an AppSec team is knowing that the security team may need some retraining from a point of view, because once you're in the cloud and SaaS environment, doing infrastructure as code is different than having your physical appliances there as well. So you need to know, you need to understand JSON. You need to understand, what's the difference when you're doing it via code versus via appliances. Now, all our offerings right now are presently going through the ISO 27001 certification. So all 140 of those products will be ISO certified from a security point of view. The other thing that we touched on is, and we'll get to it even further, is we do have the ability to do the geolocation. And I believe, Steve mentioned earlier that we have the ability also to localize and identify almost down to the bare metal where that data is residing as well. which in a cloud and SaaS environment is usually very difficult to do. So this is that engineering practices as far as the full life cycle that we go through before we're deploying our products. So this really speaks to the fact that we practice security and privacy by design. So it starts from the point of view of what are you doing at the SDLC, and what are you doing throughout that whole life cycle to make sure that you're completing the testing before the products are coming up live on the platform. All right, this speaks to how we protect our client data, and this goes back to continuous assessment from the point of view of we're undergo continuous audits. We do encryption from end to end. Not only do we encryption in transit, at rest, we look at how do we encrypt in use as well. Again, the external collateral, so I won't read to you guys what's on the slide, is a good place to take a look at not only what's our EU model clause say, what are we doing from a privacy point of view, and the SaaS Trust website is the index of pretty much the authoritative source for what are we doing from an external and internal security point of view that we can share with our customers. This is really just our ever-changing regulatory environment. You guys are all familiar with what happened with Safe Harbor, with at least the Shrem. So Safe Harbor, technically right now, is in limbo. It's been invalidated by the European courts, which essentially means that if you were relying on Safe Harbor to store your information from Europe outside of Europe, you need to move to your model clauses, or you need to look at things like binding corporate rules. Because essentially, Safe Harbor was deemed no longer good enough from a security standard point of view, at least in the European directive's eyes. So essentially, the way we look at this is, right now there's more than 80 countries with some type of privacy or security regulations on their books. So we look at it from the point of view that if you're building a strong foundation from a securities controls point of view, that as these additional regulations come out, you can just say, okay, do I need to adapt or tune my controls? And that really speaks to cloud and SaaS security in general, moving from your traditional standard controls that are basically all in place so you can meet your regulatory compliance from your audit point of view, to now being able to move to really adaptive controls, where you have your same baseline, but as you see changes in regulatory regimes, as you see changes in new attacks coming in from threat intelligence, we have the ability to start looking at our overall control environment and say, okay, we have a good baseline set, but where else do we need to start tuning our controls or adjusting the controls going forward? And this way, you should be looking at the controls from a point of view that what was good 2 months ago may no longer be the right control right now, given the current threat environment. So by having the ability to adapt controls, not only to changes in regulation, but actively adapt to different threats coming in, or leveraging the threat intelligence, it gives you the ability to create a much more robust environment. And a lot of questions that I usually get is, from the overall security of the SaaS and cloud type of environment, isn't my own data center safer? The answer is usually, a lot of times from what I've seen, the cloud environment and the SaaS environment can actually be safer, because as a practitioner, how many has had to negotiate with different technology groups to say, okay, what do you mean I can only patch this gigantic database twice a year? From an IBM point of view, as we see as new vulnerabilities and new threats are coming out, we're constantly looking at, okay, so how do we dynamically patch and maintain our environment? So from a point of view, if we're constantly patching and updating our environment, the developer's code that's sitting on top of that environment, if you're using Bluemix, it's going to be more robust and more, as you're using that microservices, more agile and better able to deal with that continuous patching environment than the environment that's in our own infrastructure, where you have to negotiate, can I only patch twice a year, or I have to patch now because it's an emergency. So from that kind of context, oftentimes it'll be a more robust or secure environment. So some of the things as a customer or a client point of view that you need to do is, if you're functioning in the cloud or SaaS environment, is make sure you're correctly classifying your data. Going back to that fundamental basic risk framework that I showed, that relies on having some kind of basic data classification scheme. This way you can start thinking about, as I move the stuff to the cloud, maybe I'm moving a tier 1 regulated application, but that's going to have different security characteristics. So maybe if I'm moving a tier 1, I'm going to want end-to-end encryption. I'm going to want to make sure that I'm managing my own keys. I'm going to make sure that there's full logging and monitoring on it. Whereas if I'm taking maybe a tier 4 application that's our regular applications, in that case, okay, so maybe I don't need full end-to-end encryption. Maybe I don't need to log and monitor every event that's going on from that point of view, because part of leveraging that risk framework is to design a solid control foundation, but also look at it from the point of view, just like in our own data centers. You can't apply the same level of protection to everything. It's not cost effective, and it may actually result in a bad experience for that application. So by using that risk framework and by classifying your data, you can say, what characteristics does it need to meet from a security point of view, and you can optimize around those applications that you move into that environment. The next thing is configuring the services correctly, and that's one of the key things where the training goes in. As you're moving into the cloud environment, understanding what the difference is between infrastructure as code, understanding how do you do key management. There's several episodes of companies, actually I think 2 of them went out of business last year, but they actually published their keys by accident into the public space, and the attackers got hold of the keys before they did, and essentially wound up trying to ransom that for the company, and the company didn't go for the ransom. They wound up deleting everything that company had in a different cloud provider space. So understanding how do you do key management, how do you do redundancy, how are you doing, you're defining your roles. And that's the other thing too, when you're thinking about that segregation of duty issues, how do you segregate your cloud environment so if there is an incident, no one single compromise can take down your whole virtual infrastructure. So you need to start thinking about that. And that goes back to the training of the workforce as well. Not just training the security teams, but training the technology teams as well on what good code looks like. We have a robust training program for our developers of how do you do secure code. We go all the way from like a white belt to a black belt type model from a secure code development program. And again, it's not because the developers want to develop bad things. It's just that when I was learning to develop code, you weren't taught how to securely code. You were taught, okay, here's how you develop code, here's how you get product out. So secure coding wasn't something that was taught when I was in school. So you need to make sure, how do you train the developers, how are you looking at it? And the other thing too is when you look at the output of the scans, what we look at is if certain teams are recoding or constantly coding certain types of errors in, it gives us a good environment to say, okay, we need to work on cross-site scripting, we need to work on cross-site reflection with these guys, because we are seeing that they're coding similar types of issues. From verifying your cloud service provider's audit posture, again, we have the SSAE 16s, we undergo regular audits because of the different types of data that we have, so that's something that you want to look at. The other thing too is from a log analytics and usage related, you want to take a look at, okay, so what do I need or what do I want from an alert point of view feeding into my SIM, feeding into my security event monitoring. Because from a lot of times you can get a lot from the application logs feeding into your SIMs. It's just a matter of, do you configure it, do you ask for it, as in how do you build it into your system. Lastly, this is the trust site that we talked about earlier, that essentially focuses on everything from a SaaS and cloud security that we publish out to the public domain. So it talks about everything from the testing, how do you deal with the different privacy issues and the challenges around that. It also talks about our EU model clauses. So really, from our point of view, this is the last slide, so I'm definitely running ahead of schedule here. I think we got about 15 minutes left. Is, as an organization, have a good definition of what your risk tolerance is. So I found that actually by coming up and mapping that framework, not only with the technology team, where it gave us the solution of, okay, here's the roadmap, as long as you define that application correctly and can meet those characteristics, then I'm agnostic as to whether we do it in our own data center, whether you do it in your colo, or whether we do it in the hybrid cloud, because it gives you that decision tree essentially to be able to say, hey, we can meet these characteristics so we can do it anywhere. Make sure that you're up to date on what are the best practices that are in use as far as the changes in how you code things, the changes in how do you do virtual IPS, IDS versus your firewall-based appliances. And the other key thing is understand what are your obligations, whether you're functioning in infrastructure as a service or whether it's platform as a service, to have that clear delineation that if I'm the client, what do my security teams need to focus on, if I'm the provider, what am I providing you as your baseline set of security? So this way you understand what the handoffs are and what the differences are as you look at the different infrastructure. Essentially, we're in our SaaS and trust sites, we do publish a lot of the information security point of view. Some of this stuff we'll exchange with you guys only under a direct NDA, because clearly we don't want to publish the roadmap for somebody to hack us. We do publish our geolocation centers, so if you're in Europe and things like that, you can see where which countries our data centers in, and based on which SaaS, where that data lives, for those applications. And that's really to help with those conversations with the different country compliance with the European directives. That's really it. If you guys have any questions, I'm always open for questions. You guys have any questions? Yep.
What would you have done about that?
So that's an excellent question. So I think the key thing is, everybody, I guess, nowadays is expecting some kind of an incident. So I think the key thing is that the time to detection is critical, is how quickly can you pick up on bad things that are going on in your environment, because a lot of times what you see historically is there's a long window before it goes addressed. So what we're looking at from the cloud and SaaS point of view is how do you leverage those additional threat intelligence that's out there so you decrease the patching time? Because again, a lot of the things that you see you get taken advantage of are because you have to negotiate a window of, okay, so I have to wait a quarter before I can patch something. Meanwhile, you're exposed from that point of view. So one of the benefits of that cloud and SaaS area is hopefully is that rapid patching, rapid detection. And the next generation is really how do you leverage the threat intelligence that's out there? So as soon as you see things coming from X-Force, as soon as you see things coming from the other threat intelligence feeds, is your infrastructure or is your provider's infrastructure? So the threat intelligence feed is, so a lot of times, so if you look at X-Force, it gathers threats of known bad IP ranges, known malware that's out there across the board. And what you can do from that point of view is you can automate it on your endpoints, or from our point of view, from a cloud point of view. As soon as you get that threat intelligence, there'll be a confidence interval that says, okay, I know this IP address has been responsible for malware. So you can start dropping that right away at your firewall or at your virtual infrastructure right away before it's even coming into your system. So a lot of it is, as soon as you see something from the threat intelligence, how quickly can you start leveraging some of the computer power to say, okay, drop that as it's coming, before it even comes in. So you're dropping it essentially at your gateway there.
So that specifically may tend to get very difficult to manage if you're dealing with an application with a lot of microservices.
Yep.
And then one of the microservices ends up getting hacked. Do you turn off that microservice on the application, or because
So that is a good question. So some of the key things. So I can speak personally from having 4.5 years of experience doing it. Where what we've done is, so initially the approach was the DevOps guys would just blow it out and bring something back up. But the problem is then you lose the learning from that environment. So what we've done after that, what we started doing after that, is we started quarantining it. So essentially by quarantining it off to the security team so we could see exactly what's going on in that microservice, so we could learn that the next time we bring up that microservice that we're going to basically make sure that we've addressed that vulnerability there. But yeah, so my approach is I'd prefer to quickly quarantine it as soon as you see something going on. This way you can learn from it and say, okay, for the next, bring up that microservice, what do we need to address from a security concern to get rid of that? And so the key thing is kind of how you gather that learning. And the other key thing too is as you do incident response and forensics in the cloud, as a practitioner that's been doing it, I've had to alter what my standard operating procedures are, because once you hit the load balancer, sometimes you lose a lot of data. So you have to look at, okay, what other metadata is available? What other things can I get from the application logs that are going to give me that same trail? And for us, it's also, how do I quarantine those virtual instances so it's still up and running, but we can learn what's going on in there quickly and bring up the new service.
So quarantine is setable.
Yeah. Any other questions? So I think our plan is to be able to actually give you the comprehensive services that you're looking for. Because what we do is going back to that map where we were talking about how do you manage the access, how do you do the identity, is we have the ability to map what products would meet those needs from a security characteristic point of view. So we can say that if it's tier 1 data, here's the pretty much the product suite that would match that as far as the package that you would need to deal with it. So we can do that. I don't think we expect to be everything to everybody. And as it's known, it's public knowledge, we also brought a cloud broker, and the game plan around that is to optimize it. Because even as a practitioner before joining IBM, I was still in 3 different clouds from the point of view of looking at what was optimized for what. It didn't make sense to put everything all into one space. And the other thing that started too is how do you do redundancy as far as your business continuity within the cloud? Because if you're locked into one provider, you can do maybe bit level replication to another, but then the question is, can you bring up that environment in that other provider, which is another good question as well. And that's where the containerization like Docker and the open standards are come into play from our point of view of if you're doing it in that truly open standard, you should be able to bring it up regardless of who your provider is. But again, I think our plan is from dealing with our enterprise customers to be able to come to them and help and look at it from a point of view of that we can meet those security characteristics that you require, but here's the products that you would need to be utilizing in the cloud. Which in some cases, a lot of the CISOs and the CIOs that I've spoken with actually want that rather than having to go into the marketplace and figure, okay, I think I need this, I think I need that, I think I need that. So we can give you that holistic, more of a holistic approach. We're saying here's the suite of products that we can enable that will give you that level of security. And again, that is a good point, and that's, I'd say, probably one of the differentiators between how IBM does cloud and some of our other providers do cloud, where you need a good education of what you need to bring online in that marketplace and whether it's going to play nice altogether or not.
We should actually wrap up.
Okay.